Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The town of Ember Hollow didn't look like much on a map, just a sleepy ribbon of cottages pressed between whispering woods and wheat yellow fields. But it had a memory like a locked drawer. It remembered who baked the best bread, who stole from whose garden 2 summers ago, and who was 3 weeks late with rent and too proud to ask for help. The people there had a way of watching without staring and speaking without saying anything too directly. Secrets in Ember Hollow weren't shouted, they were folded quietly and slipped into the lining of daily life. Helen Marsh, for better or worse, was one of those secrets people kept politely out of conversation. She lived in a 2-story stone house with ivy crawling up the corners and a porch swing that creaked only when no one was around to hear it. Her presence was like a long-lost letter, once treasured, now shelved. To the outside world, she was the kind of woman who moved through the day like clockwork, modest skirts, hair always pinned up with a stubborn curl refusing to stay tucked, and the same silver ring on her finger, since the day Nathan slid it on years ago in a church that smelled of candle wax and trembling vows. She wasn't invisible, she was just the kind of visible no one paused to look at anymore. And Helen, well, she accepted that. Life had given her a man, 2 children, and the long shadows of routine. In her silence, she kept a collection of small joys. The way sunlight hit the pantry window in the morning, the sound of her daughter humming while setting the table, or the way her husband's shoes once scuffed the floor in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. But time had a way of sanding down everything, even love. There was a time when Nathan Marsh was the kind of man whose laughter filled entire rooms and made women lean in without realizing they were doing it. He had a boyish charm despite the graying at his temples, the kind of magnetism that didn't need polishing. He once looked at Helen as though she was made of stardust and not just skin and habit. But now he came home quieter. Smelled different. Not bad, just different. Like new cologne trying to erase an old scent. He ate in silence, scrolled through his phone more often, and offered kisses like signatures, necessary, but without soul. Helen never asked where the shift began, maybe because she feared she'd already lived the answer. The distance didn't announce itself with a bang, only the slow trickle of skipped dinners and mismatched schedules. She knew something had shifted when Nathan started talking about consulting help for the family business. Said he needed to modernize things. Get with the times. That's when the name Isla Baines entered their life. At first, just in passing. Isla thinks we should digitize the books. Isla says there's untapped profit in quarterly projections. Then it became, Isla recommended this new cafe, and Isla said my old suit made me look tired. Helen listened, nodded, and stitched her suspicions into silence. She never asked who Isla really was, because the answer hung in the air every time Nathan said her name with just a little too much weight on the A. Isla Baines was not a whisper like Helen. She was a trumpet, a flame that didn't flicker but danced with arrogance. She came into Ember Hollow once a week from Weymouth City, stepping out of shiny cars in heels that dared the pavement to complain. Her lipstick was redder than cherries in June, and her nails were small blades wrapped in color. People stared. How could they not? She walked like she knew the world owed her something, and she was here to collect. The town pretended not to notice, but Ember Hollow noticed everything. Especially the way Nathan stood a little straighter when Isla was near. Isla wasn't born in that town, didn't share in its roots or rain-soaked traditions, but she carved a space for herself in Nathan's life like a knife slipping into butter. The other women watched from behind curtains, murmured things like bold and too city for her own good, but secretly some of them envied her. Isla, for her part, felt superior. To her, Helen was the ghost of a woman, someone who let life happen to her, not someone who took it by the throat and demanded more. Isla saw Nathan as a prize someone else didn't know how to keep clean. She convinced herself that she wasn't stealing anything, she was rescuing him. That's what made her dangerous. Not her beauty, not her confidence, but her belief that she deserved the life Helen had simply for wanting it more. That was the seed from which her twisted little game began to grow. A game with lace, mirrors, and vanity hiding under its petticoat. It began subtly, as most wicked ideas do. One afternoon, while sorting through client files in Nathan's office, Isla came across a photo album partially buried beneath ledgers and invoices. She opened it, more from boredom than sentiment, and there she saw Helen. Not today's Helen, but that Helen. The one in the soft blue gown. The one smiling like she had caught the last golden hour of her youth and held it captive. Her hair cascaded like it had been painted. Her shoulders kissed by lace. It struck Isla, not just the beauty of the woman, but the arrogance of time in stealing it. She stared longer than she meant to. That moment planted something bitter. Isla didn't want to look like Helen had. She wanted to look better. She told herself it wasn't competition, it was a statement. A reclamation. So she began her quiet project. Found a tailor in Weymouth who could replicate the dress down to the last pearl. She had the photograph secretly scanned and enlarged so every fold of the fabric could be studied. She practiced walking in it in front of her full-length mirror until the hem obeyed her sway. It wasn't about stealing Nathan anymore. She already believed he belonged to her in everything but paperwork. No, this was about Helen. About dragging her from whatever dusty pedestal Nathan had left her on and showing everyone, that the torch had already passed. Isla would walk into the harvest dinner wearing Helen's past. But this time, it would be hers. The dress arrived on a Friday wrapped in ivory tissue and pride. Isla stood over the open box in her bedroom as if it were an altar. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from that strange anticipation one feels before setting fire to something. The tailor had followed her instructions down to the last thread. It was sky blue, not the loud, sharp kind of blue that demanded attention, but a shade soft enough to whisper elegance. The lace danced over the fabric like ivy climbing a forgotten gate, and the neckline was gentle, hinting at femininity without screaming for it. Isla held it up against her chest and studied herself in the mirror. She tilted her head slightly, tried on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and nodded in satisfaction. There was power in the symmetry, her wearing the very same dress Helen wore in the photo. But it wasn't the fabric she wanted to recreate, it was the illusion. The illusion that she was now the woman worthy of the pedestal Nathan's memory had once placed Helen on. She had spent weeks perfecting this, obsessing over details, pouring herself into the role. She even practiced walking differently, shoulders drawn back just enough, chin lifted to an angle that suggested nobility rather than vanity. It wasn't just about impressing Nathan anymore. It was about erasing the version of Helen that still lingered in people's minds like an unfinished song. Isla had grown tired of being seen as an accessory in Nathan's life, a thrilling detour rather than a destination. The dress, for her, was a declaration. She was no longer on the sidelines. She was stepping into the story and rewriting it, seam by seam. In her mind, she envisioned the reactions. She would walk into the harvest dinner, and silence would fall like a curtain. There'd be a collective breath held at the sight of her. People would nudge one another, whisper behind wine glasses, wondering if Helen would even dare to attend after being so thoroughly outdone. Isla imagined Helen showing up in one of her dull cardigans or frumpy floral skirts, looking every bit the woman who'd let herself fade into the wallpaper of her marriage. She wouldn't stand a chance against the spectacle Isla had planned. The venue, the people, the ambience, they were all pieces on a stage Isla intended to own. She'd even had her hair done differently, longer, looser waves to mirror Helen's look from the wedding photo. But better, finer. Like Helen was the sketch and she the finished painting. Isla had even memorized phrases that would seem effortlessly charming if anyone complimented her dress. "Oh, just a little vintage inspiration," she'd say with a shrug. Fell in love with a photo and had it made. Casual, humble, but sharp enough to sting if Helen happened to hear it. There was a rehearsed art in her tone, a blade tucked neatly behind a smile. Isla didn't believe in mercy when it came to rivalry. Not in romance, not in appearance, not in reputation. She'd clawed her way into the light her whole life, and she wasn't about to let a woman like Helen, with her stale affection and oven-warmed hands, keep Nathan under her ghostly spell. Isla saw Helen as a placeholder, a relic kept around out of habit. She told herself men stayed in dead marriages not out of love, but convenience. And she was here to make inconvenience look divine. Nathan hadn't asked about the dress, not really. When she mentioned she was having something special made, he merely nodded and said she'd look lovely in anything. That annoyed her more than she admitted. She wanted him to ask questions, to be intrigued. But he had grown quieter around her, distracted even. Some days he spoke of the business with a distant tone, his eyes occasionally drifting to the window like they were looking for a way back to something unnamed. Isla had chalked it up to stress, maybe guilt. Men always felt guilt like a stone in their shoe, bothersome, but never enough to stop walking. What she didn't know was that Nathan had been visiting the attic lately. One night, unable to sleep, he had pulled out the wedding album again. He stared at Helen in the photograph, the way her hand rested on his arm, like they were both anchoring each other. It stirred something in him he didn't expect. Not regret, exactly. More like dissonance. He had forgotten that version of her existed. The one with fire in her eyes and mischief in her grin. The Helen who had once danced barefoot in the rain after drinking too much red wine, daring the heavens to catch her. She had not always been quiet. Life had dimmed her, but not erased her. And now, sitting across from Isla most days, he couldn't help but notice the difference between noise and substance. Isla was dazzling, no doubt. But Helen was depth, even when silent. As the harvest dinner drew near, Helen found herself staring at the photo in the hallway more often. The dress was still there, tucked neatly in the back of her closet behind coats and old Christmas boxes. She hadn't worn it since that day, her wedding, bright with promise and vows that still echoed somewhere in the walls of her home. One morning, after brushing her daughter's hair and folding the laundry, she reached into the closet and ran her fingers across the lace. It felt like memory, soft, stubborn, and stitched with something she hadn't touched in years. She pulled it out slowly, as though waking it from a long sleep. No decision was made in that moment, no plan hatched. Just a pause, a long, curious pause, as she held it against her and turned slowly before the mirror. She didn't look 20 anymore. There were lines now, and softness where there once was tightness. But her eyes, they hadn't changed. And something in them flickered. Not out of vanity, not out of spite. Something simpler, more honest. It was the quiet remembering of a woman who had once felt radiant, and might feel it again, not for anyone else's eyes but her own. She folded the dress back, but differently this time. Not like storage, but like an intention. The air in the house shifted. A light breeze stirred the curtains, as though even the wind sensed a change coming. Helen didn't say anything to Nathan that evening, but she smiled when she passed the hallway mirror, and for the first time in a long time, she recognized the woman looking back. The evening of the harvest dinner arrived cloaked in the kind of early autumn chill that made old windows rattle and leaves shiver before falling. Ember Hollow glowed beneath a low sky, paper lanterns flickering between branches like suspended stars. The dinner was hosted, as always, in the garden behind the Whitmore estate, a spacious stretch of land with winding stone paths, round tables draped in linen, and a band of local fiddlers who played like the air itself was listening. Carriages and cars began to arrive in soft procession. People came dressed in their best, men in tailored coats, women in dresses they dusted off once a year for this very night. The air smelled of roasted squash, sweet cider, and fresh bread. Conversations floated gently across tables, layered with laughter and the soft clinking of cutlery. It was the kind of evening where everything looked beautiful, even if nothing had changed. Nathan arrived earlier than usual, pacing through the crowd with a strained smile that felt more like muscle memory than joy. He greeted a few familiar faces, offered a glass of wine to a cousin he barely spoke to, but mostly his eyes scanned the edges of the gathering, as if he were waiting for something he hadn't told himself he expected. He hadn't seen Helen leave the house. She hadn't said if she would come. Part of him thought she'd skip it this year. Another part, quieter, deeper, hoped she wouldn't. When Isla arrived, she was fashionably late, as planned. Her entrance was choreographed to perfection. She stepped from her car with a kind of unspoken flourish, the hem of her dress catching just enough wind to dance around her legs like it was in awe of her. Her hair was curled loosely around her shoulders, and the lace of her gown hugged her figure in all the ways she had intended. She wore the blue like a flag, bold, soft, strategic. Conversations paused when she passed by. Eyes followed her, not all, but enough. She offered polite nods, her heels crunching softly against the gravel as she made her way through the garden. She caught sight of Nathan, and felt the swell of triumph. His expression froze, not with admiration but confusion. That wasn't what she expected. He looked at her, yes, but his gaze wasn't warm. It was hesitant. Isla kept walking, her smile fixed. She reminded herself it didn't matter how he looked at her now. What mattered was what came next. This was the night she'd step out of the shadow of the affair and into the center of the life she believed should already be hers. She took a glass from a passing tray, nodded at a few women she'd barely tolerated, and posed near a flickering lantern so the light would catch her at the right angle. Her dress shimmered. Her presence announced itself like thunder following distant lightning. And then, without warning, silence wrapped itself around the garden in a way no one could explain. She came not with spectacle, but with a silence that hushed the air around her. She walked slowly, deliberately, her gaze calm, her expression unreadable. The same dress, identical in cut, lace, and color, floated around her figure like a memory reawakened. But the effect was different. While Isla wore the dress like armor, Helen wore it like truth. Her hair was down, waves tumbling in a way that looked neither styled nor accidental. Her skin held no trace of makeup, and yet she glowed, not with artifice, but with something more dangerous. Authenticity. Nathan saw her before she reached the tables. His breath caught. The sound around him faded, as if his ears were underwater. There she was, not the wife who packed his lunch and folded his shirts, but the woman who once made him believe the world could be kind. Her eyes scanned the crowd slowly, not searching for anyone, but acknowledging everything. And when her gaze met Isla's, something passed between them, sharp, brief, unspoken. Isla's glass trembled slightly in her hand. She hadn't imagined this possibility. In all her calculations, Helen wasn't supposed to show up, much less like this. Dressed in the same gown, yet commanding it in a way Isla never could. The crowd, sensing the tension, pretended to focus on the buffet table, but their ears leaned toward the center of the room. Two women, one dress, and a silence that weighed more than words. The rest of the evening unfolded like a slow burn. Helen didn't need to speak loudly or gesture broadly. Her presence did the talking. She moved from one table to the next, exchanging kind smiles, thanking people for their compliments, laughing once or twice, not forced, not performative. Nathan followed her with his eyes, as though trying to remember something that once belonged to him. Isla, now half frozen in her curated corner, felt the unraveling begin. It wasn't immediate. It was worse, it was patient. Each time someone glanced at her, their eyes soon wandered to Helen. Not out of judgment, but curiosity. Admiration. Isla had dressed to win a war, but Helen hadn't even entered the battlefield. And somehow she was winning. Isla tried to recover, striking up conversations, laughing louder, adjusting her posture. But it felt off-key, as though she were playing music that didn't match the mood anymore. She realized with a sickening curl in her stomach that the dress wasn't enough. It had never been about the dress. What Helen carried wasn't sewn into fabric. It was something lived, worn deep like rings in a tree. Isla caught a glimpse of herself in the garden mirror hung beside the outdoor bar. Same dress, same fit, but somehow she looked smaller, duller, like someone pretending to be something they never truly were. For the first time in years, Isla felt what Helen must have felt so often, overlooked. She looked around, hoping someone would meet her gaze and anchor her back into the moment. But the room had already turned its attention elsewhere, and Isla, in all her planning, hadn't prepared for this silence. The kind that didn't accuse but erased. The powder room was small, lit by a single ornate lamp whose golden glow did nothing to soften Isla's reflection. She stared at herself in the mirror, standing motionless against the tiled floor as a distant murmur of laughter from the garden filtered faintly through the closed door. The dress still clung to her like second skin, flawless in construction but now suddenly foreign, as though it no longer belonged to her body. Her hands rested on either side of the porcelain sink, cold against the ceramic, her knuckles stiff from holding a glass for too long. She had tried to play the part. She had done everything right at least by her rules. The entrance, the dress, the timing. But now the evening felt like a cruel mirror turned inward. Her own eyes, once glittering with anticipation, now betrayed the fatigue of someone who had just realized they were dancing to music only they could hear. There was a stillness in her that scared her, not because it was silent, but because it was unfamiliar. Isla had always thrived on chaos, on winning, on pushing people's boundaries just enough to stay in control. But this wasn't about control anymore. She had planned an unveiling, and ended up being the one exposed. Outside, the laughter didn't die. If anything, it grew lighter, fuller, sounds that rubbed against Isla's bones like sandpaper. She tried to steady herself, lifted her chin, and adjusted the straps of the dress like they might reattach her to the power she once felt wearing it. But the truth scratched behind her ribs. No matter how closely the fabric matched, no matter how elegant the fit, it couldn't rewrite the years Helen had lived inside hers. There was a certain kind of beauty that couldn't be manufactured, only earned. The realization dropped inside Isla like a stone, silent but heavy. She had stepped into Helen's past thinking she could wear it better, wear it brighter. But the past doesn't lend itself to strangers. It stays loyal to the ones who lived it. Isla had spent so long trying to outshine a woman she thought had given up on herself, only to realize too late that Helen had simply stopped putting her glow on display. She had mistaken modesty for surrender, silence for defeat. And now, with her reflection staring back like a stranger in borrowed skin, Isla felt something she hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. Not the performative kind, not the flirty "do I look alright" kind, but real, choking uncertainty. The kind that stripped away all her polish and made her feel 13 again, too tall for her age and never quite enough for anyone's full attention. The door creaked softly behind her, and Isla caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. It wasn't Helen, it was a woman from town, someone whose name she didn't remember, someone who had always looked at her like one would study a painting they didn't quite understand. The woman smiled politely, adjusted her scarf, and said nothing as she stepped into the room. Isla offered a nod, too stiff, too rehearsed. She wanted to leave, to vanish before more of these small glances pierced through her. Instead, she lingered, listening to the quiet shuffle of fabric and perfume. There was no hostility, no mockery, just indifference. And that oddly cut deeper. It dawned on Isla that she had become what she used to pity in others: background. She stepped away from the mirror, smoothed her hair one last time, and exited the room with the grace of a woman, trying not to let anyone see the slow collapse of her pride. The air outside bit a little sharper now. People still talked and smiled, plates clinked gently, children chased one another between tables. Yet somehow, none of it included her. She passed by a couple laughing at some shared joke, and neither of them glanced up. Another woman brushed past, murmuring an apology that didn't wait for acknowledgement. It was as if the dress had rendered her invisible instead of radiant. Or maybe, she thought, Helen's presence had made people see Isla for what she truly was: an echo dressed in someone else's melody. Helen hadn't spoken to Isla all evening, but her silence had been louder than any confrontation. She had moved with the elegance of someone who didn't need to defend her place. There was no tension in her posture, no guarded smiles or tightened jaw. Just calm. A terrifying, graceful calm that said she didn't need to prove anything. Not to Isla, not to Nathan, not to herself. And that, more than anything, disarmed Isla. It wasn't that Helen had won. It was that she hadn't even played. Isla had built this entire night on the premise that she and Helen were in competition, but now she saw that Helen hadn't come to compete. She had come as herself. Not the wife, not the mother, not the neglected spouse or the wounded woman. Just herself. That was the cruelest part of it all. Isla had orchestrated a war, brought weapons, wore armor, memorized battle strategy, only to find there was no battlefield. Just a quiet woman in a beautiful dress who didn't need to shout to be seen. As Isla sat at the edge of the garden, legs crossed tightly, fingers tracing the rim of an untouched glass, she realized the irony. All this time, she believed she was the storm. But tonight, she'd met something stronger. The stillness after it. The walk back home was long, not because of the distance but because of the silence that stretched between them. Helen walked ahead for the most part, her heels clicking softly against the uneven cobblestone paths that snaked through the heart of Ember Hollow. Nathan trailed slightly behind, not out of reluctance, but because he couldn't quite find the rhythm to walk beside her. Everything about her tonight had unsettled him, not in a way that made him uncomfortable, but in a way that made him painfully aware. She hadn't looked at him once during the dinner, not with bitterness, not with accusation. It would have been easier if she had. Instead, she had moved through the evening like she owed no one an explanation, not even him. There was something sobering about watching the woman you thought had dimmed suddenly walk into a room fully alight, and not for you. He wanted to speak, but words felt like the wrong tool for what he carried. She hadn't asked where he'd been the nights he'd come home late. She hadn't questioned the changes, the absences, the scent that wasn't hers lingering on his collar. And maybe that was what gnawed at him most, that she had made space for his betrayal without complaint, as if she had long since learned not to expect more from him. That quiet resignation burned deeper than any argument ever could. They reached the gate and paused, neither one moving to open it right away. Nathan stared at the rusted iron latch while Helen looked up at the window on the second floor, where a soft light still glowed from the children's bedroom. It grounded her, reminded her that no matter what was fractured between them, her world had anchors beyond him. She finally pushed the gate open, the hinges groaning slightly as if they too had aged in silence. Nathan followed her in. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of chamomile tea and wood polish. She slipped off her shoes, unpinned her hair, and walked into the kitchen without speaking. He stood in the doorway like a guest unsure whether he was welcome. He wanted to tell her she had looked beautiful, but something about the way she moved told him that kind of compliment would feel hollow now. She didn't need him to notice. She had remembered on her own. She poured water into the kettle, her movements smooth, unaffected. It was the same kitchen she'd stood in 1,000 times before, but tonight she moved through it like someone who had finally reclaimed the space. When she turned to look at him, her gaze didn't search him, it measured. Not cruelly, not coldly, but with the calm precision of someone deciding how much of herself she was still willing to give. "I didn't wear it for her," she said softly, placing 2 mugs on the counter. Her voice wasn't heavy, but it carried the weight of things she had chosen not to say over the past year. Nathan blinked, not sure how to respond. "I know," he said eventually, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Helen looked at him for a moment longer, then returned her focus to the tea bags, dipping them gently into each cup like she had done hundreds of nights before. But this time, the gesture felt unfamiliar. He felt like he was watching a woman he no longer had the language to speak to. "You forgot I was still here," she said after a pause, not as an accusation, but as a quiet observation. Nathan swallowed. He wanted to protest, to tell her he hadn't forgotten, but the truth hung too loudly between them to be denied. He had forgotten. Not in the way people forget birthdays or promises, but in the way people grow used to a sunrise, always there, always beautiful, but eventually taken for granted. Helen placed a cup in front of him, then took hers and walked to the living room. She didn't tell him to follow, but after a long moment he did. They sat across from each other, the fire in the hearth crackling low, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Helen didn't look at him as she spoke again, her words barely above a whisper. "Do you love her?" The question didn't cut like a blade. It settled like a stone in water, sinking deep without stirring much on the surface. Nathan opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't know how to answer that. Isla had stirred something in him, excitement, youth, a sense of being seen. But love, that felt like a word too sacred to tie to whatever it was he'd been doing. "I don't know," he said finally, and in saying it, he realized how small the affair felt compared to the moment he was in now. Helen didn't react. She just nodded, her face unreadable. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said, taking a sip of tea. "She's not the one I've been waiting to hear that from." Nathan watched her carefully, the truth of her words settling in like dust. For the first time in a long while, he saw her as someone separate from him, someone with a life and strength of her own, someone who had waited, hoped, and heard in silence. He had believed her silence was passive. Tonight, he understood it had been survival. And perhaps, in the quiet of this room, she was choosing whether he still fit into the life she was reclaiming. The morning after the harvest dinner came without ceremony. The sky remained overcast, casting a dull silver light across the wooden floorboards of the Marsh household. Helen rose early, not because she needed to, but because sleep had left her before the sun rose. There were no urgent chores waiting, no voices echoing through the halls. Just the quiet hum of the kettle heating and the familiar creak of the floorboard near the pantry door. She moved through the kitchen with steady hands, though something inside her still echoed from the night before, something ancient and alive, like a long-closed room that had been opened again and found to be full of light. She wore no dress today. No lace, no blue, no illusion of anything other than herself. A loose robe, bare feet, a simple braid down her back. She stood by the window, sipping her tea and watching a pair of birds flit between branches. And as the steam rose toward her face, she found herself thinking not about Nathan, not about Isla, not even about the looks or the whispers from last night. She was thinking about how long it had taken her to come home to herself. How many years she had been in the room, but not quite in her own skin. She hadn't just worn the dress for one evening. In a way, she'd worn her life for everyone else, neatly, quietly, and without wrinkles. It had taken one night, one step into her own history, to realize how much of it she had abandoned for the comfort of being needed. Nathan came downstairs late, slower than usual, as though his limbs had grown heavier overnight. He found her in the kitchen, not expecting her to speak, and for a moment they stood in the same room like two people who had survived something neither wanted to name. She offered him no invitation, but neither did she turn away. He poured himself a cup of coffee in silence, the scrape of the chair legs the only sound as he pulled one out and sat across from her. He looked older this morning, less from fatigue than from reflection. The weight of unspoken years sat on his shoulders like a coat he'd only just remembered he was wearing. His voice, when it finally came, was dry and careful. "You looked beautiful last night," he said, eyes not quite meeting hers. Helen said nothing at first. She stirred her tea once more, as if considering whether the comment needed a response at all. When she did speak, her voice was soft but firm, like a door being closed gently but decisively. I didn't do it for you. He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for forgiveness either. Not yet. Maybe he knew better than to expect that. Forgiveness wasn't a favor she would give simply because he asked. It was something he'd have to earn, if she even decided it was something she wanted to offer. And that, perhaps, was the most jarring shift between them. He could no longer assume she would remain simply because she always had. Her presence was no longer guaranteed, and it made the air between them feel new and sharp. Across town, Isla sat by the hotel window, still in her robe, makeup half wiped, the dress draped across the chair like a silk confession. She hadn't slept. Not deeply, anyway. She had closed her eyes and found herself pacing again through the garden, back in that moment of stillness when Helen arrived and every plan Isla had made quietly turned to dust. She had wanted to win, and in her mind, she had believed the dress was her weapon. But she had misjudged the war. It hadn't been a war of appearances. It hadn't been about beauty or elegance or confidence. It had been about presence, about roots, about a woman showing up fully in her own name without needing to steal anyone else's. And Isla, for all her poise and polish, had walked in pretending to be someone she wasn't. The reflection in the mirror now wasn't the one she had envisioned when she zipped up that dress. It was honest and painful. She reached for a pen without knowing what she intended to write until it was already on the paper. Just one line, scribbled in her usual precise hand. No apology, no explanation, just acknowledgement. A gesture from one woman to another. She folded it, pressed it flat, and laid it gently over the fabric of the dress. Then she called the front desk and asked for a courier. No sender. No message beyond what was inside the folded page. Some stories, she realized, didn't need to be retold. Just quietly ended. The package arrived 2 days later, wrapped in clean brown paper. There was no name, no return address. Helen opened it alone, seated on the edge of the bed with the same quiet grace she had carried with her that evening. Inside, the second dress lay folded with care. And on top of it, a note that read only, "She isn't beautiful because of what she wore. She's beautiful because she doesn't have to try." Helen read it once. Then again. And finally she smiled, not because it gave her power, but because it gave her peace. She folded the note, placed it inside the small keepsake box in her drawer, and draped the second dress beside her own. She didn't need to wear it. She didn't need to claim it. Its arrival was a kind of quiet surrender, not of war, but of misunderstanding. That evening, she stepped outside with her children and sat on the porch swing while they played beneath the falling leaves. Nathan stood in the doorway, unsure whether to join, unsure if he was still part of this landscape. She didn't call him, but when he did walk over and sit beside her, she didn't move away. They sat together, listening to the wind weave through the trees. Nothing was resolved. Not yet, but something had shifted. Not everything broken must be discarded. Some things, with time, reshaped themselves into something quieter. Toi. Helen didn't know what came next. But for the first time in a long time, she was no longer waiting to be seen. She already was. Never underestimate quiet strength. You don't have to shout to be seen or compete to be valued. Your worth isn't measured by who notices you. It's reflected in how you carry yourself when no one is watching. If you've ever felt overlooked or replaced, remember, real power is not loud, it's consistent. And when you start showing up for yourself, the world has no choice but to notice. May you never forget who you are, even when the world tries to make you question your light. May grace find you in silence, and may confidence rise again from places you thought were lost. May you be covered with dignity that doesn't need applause to shine, and may peace guard your heart from people who mistake your softness for weakness. May your presence speak even when your mouth is closed, and may your truth never need decoration to be powerful. When others try to take your place, may God remind you that what's meant for you can never be worn better by another. And when your time to rise comes, may you rise without bitterness, without fear, but with quiet, radiant strength. In Jesus' name, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.